December 15th, 1968. Marcus Whitman walked into Studio 7 at WTVJ Miami with one mission: destroy Fidel Castro on live television. He had the documents. He had the smoking gun, Castro's war crimes, spelled out in classified cables that could topple a dictator. What Marcus didn't know was that Castro had already read his notes, had already seen the CIA handler's name written in the margins, had already decided that saving an American spy's life was worth sacrificing his own reputation. For 55 years, people remembered that interview as the night a cocky journalist got schooled by a master manipulator. They remembered Marcus stumbling over his words, Castro's calm dismantling of every accusation, the career that died on live TV. They never knew it was an execution disguised as an interview. And the man who died wasn't Fidel Castro. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cassette tape clicked to a stop, and Marcus Whitman's voice died in the cramped radio booth. Silence pressed against the soundproof walls of WKRP-AM, a silence that felt heavier than the humid December air seeping through the station's broken air conditioning. Outside, Miami's neon glow painted the night in electric blues and pinks. But inside Studio B, Marcus sat in the dark, staring at the microphone that had just carried his confession to 12 listeners and a handful of insomniacs. 55 years. That's how long he'd carried the weight of December 15th, 1968. 23 years since he'd last spoken about it publicly, back when the major networks still returned his calls. Now, at 64, he was Marcus Whitman of Midnight Confessions, a late-night show that occupied the dead zone between infomercials and automated weather reports. He reached for his coffee, cold, bitter, forgotten hours ago, and noticed his hand trembling, not from age, from the memory. Castro's eyes across that studio table, dark and knowing, as if he could see straight through to Marcus's soul. The way the dictator had smiled when Marcus fumbled for his notes, the ones that had promised to end careers and topple governments. The red phone light blinked. A caller. Marcus almost ignored it. The few people who listened to his show at this hour were usually drunk, lonely, or both. But something, instinct perhaps, the journalist's nose that had never quite died, made him reach for the receiver. Midnight Confessions. Breathing. Heavy. Deliberate. Then a voice, accented but careful. You told only half the story tonight, Marcus. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. Who is this? Someone who was there. Someone who remembers what you left out. Marcus's finger hovered over the disconnect button, but the voice continued, Elena Vasquez. Ring any bells? CIA Station Chief, Havana, 1967 to 1968. Died in a car accident in Caracas, January 1969. Except it wasn't an accident, was it? The room tilted. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white against the scarred wood. Elena. Christ, he hadn't spoken that name aloud in decades. I don't know what you're... Check your mail, Marcus. Then decide if you want to keep lying to those 12 loyal listeners of yours. The line went dead. Marcus sat frozen, staring at the phone as if it might bite him. Elena Vasquez, his handler, his lifeline to a story that was supposed to make his career instead of ending it. The woman whose name he'd scribbled in the margins of his notes, the notes Castro had somehow seen before the cameras ever rolled. The woman who died 3 weeks after the interview aired. A sound in the hallway made him jump, footsteps on linoleum, too heavy for Janet, the night security guard. Marcus killed the studio lights and peered through the window into the corridor. Empty. But shadows moved near the exit sign, and something in their deliberate patience made his chest tighten. He'd been careful for 23 years, changed his name once, moved 6 times, kept his head down. The Cuban exile community in Miami had long memories and longer grudges, and if they ever discovered what really happened that night in 1968, Marcus gathered his papers with shaking hands, stuffed them into his worn leather satchel. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence. The parking garage elevator wheezed to life, carrying him down into underground darkness that smelled of oil and exhaust. His Toyota sat under a flickering light, and as he approached, something white caught his eye. An envelope, tucked under his windshield wiper. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside the car, engine running, Marcus tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. A photograph fell into his lap, grainy, black and white, but unmistakably him and Castro in what looked like a hotel room. They were sitting across from each other at a small table, and Castro was sliding a manila folder toward Marcus. A folder he'd never mentioned to anyone. A folder that had contained Elena's real assignment, her actual location, the names of every asset she was running in Havana. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, 30 minutes before the cameras rolled, Hotel Nacional, room 515. You gave him everything. Marcus's vision blurred. His breath came in short gasps, because he remembered now, not the public interview, not Castro's calculated performance for the cameras, but the private conversation beforehand. The conversation where a desperate journalist, trapped and scared, had traded classified information for the promise that his career might survive the night. The conversation that had killed Elena Vasquez. And if this photograph existed, if someone had been watching, recording, waiting all these years, in his rearview mirror, headlights blazed to life. Marcus threw the Toyota into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor, tires screaming against concrete as he raced toward an exit that suddenly seemed very far away. The Toyota's engine screamed as Marcus took the garage ramp at twice the safe speed, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the mirror, the headlights followed, not aggressive, not racing, but steady, patient, professional. Marcus forced himself to breathe, to think. 23 years of paranoia had taught him the difference between imagination and real danger. This felt real. He took 3 random turns through downtown Miami's empty streets, past shuttered storefronts, and the occasional neon flicker of an all-night diner. The headlights dropped back but never disappeared entirely. By the time he reached his neighborhood in Coral Gables, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. The Spanish colonial house sat dark behind overgrown hibiscus and royal palms, its terracotta roof tiles broken in places from the last hurricane. Marcus had bought it cash in 1987, when he still had money from his book deal, before the reviews called him a conspiracy theorist, before the speaking engagements dried up. Now it was just home, quiet, safe, or it had been. Marcus parked in the driveway, studying every shadow before stepping out. The December air carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine from Mrs. Herrera's yard next door, a smell that usually calmed him. Tonight it seemed cloying, oppressive. Inside, he deadbolted the front door and drew the curtains before turning on any lights. The living room materialized around him. Worn leather furniture, bookshelves sagging under decades of collected journalism, framed photographs from a career that felt like someone else's life. There was Marcus at 28, shaking hands with Walter Cronkite. Marcus at 30, accepting the Polk Award for his series on Pentagon corruption. Marcus at 34, smiling confidently at a White House press briefing. Before Castro, before Elena, before everything went wrong. He poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his father's old chair, the photograph spread on the coffee table before him. The image was sharp enough to be damning, his younger face clearly visible, Castro's hand pushing that manila folder across the hotel room table. Room 515. How could they have known about room 515? The phone rang, and Marcus nearly dropped his glass. Hello? His voice cracked like a teenager's. Marcus. Jesus, you sound terrible. The warm Puerto Rican accent belonged to Carmen Reyes, the only person in Miami who still called him friend. Did I wake you? Marcus glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. No, I was working. What's wrong? My grandson's in trouble again. Picked up for vandalism in Little Havana. The cops are holding him overnight, but I need someone to post bail in the morning. I know it's a lot to ask. Of course. The words came automatically. Carmen had been his producer back when he hosted Miami Tonight, before the ratings tanked and the station let him go. She'd stuck by him when everyone else disappeared, helped him land the radio gig when he was broke and desperate. Her grandson Diego was a good kid, just angry at the world the way 17-year-olds should be. You're sure? It's 1500. I'll take care of it. Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in hours. This was why he stayed in Miami, why he endured the exile community's cold shoulders and the whispered rumors. Carmen Diego, the handful of people who still saw Marcus Whitman instead of the ghost of his failures. "You're an angel," Carmen said. "I'll pay you back." Don't. Marcus stared at the photograph, thinking of Elena Vasquez, of the assets whose names he'd unknowingly betrayed, of all the debts that could never be repaid. Family helps family, right? After Carmen hung up, Marcus walked to the kitchen and opened the junk drawer where he kept his checkbook. Beneath old warranties and takeout menus lay a small wooden box, the kind used for jewelry. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a silver bracelet, simple, elegant, engraved with the initials E5th. Elena had been wearing it the last time he saw her, in a Miami Beach cafe 3 days before he left for Havana. She'd briefed him on Castro's psychological profile, his weaknesses, the questions that might crack his composure. She'd been so confident in Marcus's abilities, so certain he would find the story that would expose the regime's deepest secrets. Instead, he'd been the one exposed, stripped bare by a master manipulator who'd somehow learned everything: Elena's real identity, her network, the precise nature of Marcus's mission. Castro had turned the interview into theater, making Marcus look like a fool while protecting information that would have gotten Elena killed immediately instead of 3 weeks later. Marcus closed the box and returned it to the drawer. Outside, a car door slammed. Then another. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 2 men stood beside a dark sedan parked across the street, their faces hidden in shadow. One of them raised something to his ear, a phone or a radio. Marcus's hands found the photograph on the coffee table, Elena's bracelet, the checkbook he'd need to bail out Carmen's grandson. All the small pieces of the life he'd built from the ruins of his reputation, all the people who depended on him now. The men across the street weren't moving. They were waiting, for dawn perhaps, or for him to run. Marcus poured another bourbon and settled back into his father's chair, Elena's bracelet cool against his palm. He wouldn't run, not anymore. Let them come. The bourbon burned Marcus's throat as he watched the men through the curtain gap. They'd been standing there for 20 minutes now, patient as vultures. One lit a cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating a weathered face that looked carved from stone. Cuban, Marcus thought. Definitely Cuban. The phone rang again. Marcus didn't move. Carmen wouldn't call back this late, and everyone else who might have his number was either dead or wished he was. The answering machine clicked on after 4 rings. "You have reached Marcus Whitman. Leave a message." Static. Then breathing. Then the same careful, accented voice from the radio station. "You didn't go home alone, did you, Marcus? Look outside. See the reception committee?" Marcus's grip tightened on Elena's bracelet until the silver edges bit into his palm. "They've been waiting a long time for this," the voice continued. 23 years of wondering who betrayed their operation in Havana, who gave Castro the names that got their people killed. Your audience is about to grow considerably. The machine beeped. Dial tone. Marcus set down his glass with deliberate care. His hands had stopped shaking, a bad sign he knew from experience. When the fear became this pure, this focused, it meant the situation had moved beyond panic into something worse. He pulled out his cell phone, scrolled to Carmen's number. His finger hovered over the call button. If something happened to him tonight, she'd need to know about Diego's bail money. But calling her would mean admitting this was real, that the past had finally caught up with him. Instead, Marcus opened his laptop and began typing an email. "Carmen, something's come up. Had to leave town unexpectedly. Check the kitchen counter tomorrow morning. Envelope with cash for Diego's bail. Tell him his old man Marcus believes in second chances." He paused, staring at the screen, then added, "If anyone comes asking about me, you never heard of Elena Vasquez. This is important. Protect Diego." Before he could reconsider, Marcus hit send. A soft thud came from the back of the house. Marcus froze, listening. The settling of old wood, or footsteps on his rear patio. He'd reinforced the back door after moving in, installed motion sensors and floodlights, but determined men with professional training could bypass anything a paranoid journalist might afford. Another sound, definitely not the house settling, metal against metal, someone working on the lock. Marcus moved quickly to his bedroom closet and retrieved a small fireproof safe from behind his winter coats. Inside lay a manila envelope containing everything he'd never been able to throw away: copies of his original notes from Havana, Elena's intelligence briefings, and a cassette tape labeled Insurance Policy. December 15, 1968. The tape he'd secretly recorded during his private conversation with Castro. Marcus had made it instinctively, the way any good journalist documents everything, but he'd never listened to it afterward. Couldn't bear to hear his own voice trading Elena's life for the promise of professional survival. For 23 years, the tape had sat in this safe like a cancer, growing heavier with each passing decade. Now it might be the only thing keeping him alive. Glass shattered in the kitchen. Marcus pocketed the tape and Elena's bracelet, grabbed his car keys. The front door was too risky. The sedan was still parked across the street, but his neighbor Mrs. Herrera traveled frequently, and her garage connected to an alley that ran behind the block. He slipped out through the sliding door to his back patio, staying low behind the pool equipment. Voices murmured from inside his house. At least 2 men, maybe 3. They were being careful, professional, not the exile community's usual hothead patriots, but something else, something organized. The gap in Mrs. Herrera's fence was just wide enough for Marcus to squeeze through. He'd discovered it years ago when chasing her escaped cat, never imagining he'd use it as an escape route. Her garage door was unlocked, Miami trust that seemed impossibly naive now. As Marcus climbed into his Toyota, he heard his front door splinter. The engine turned over on the first try, and Marcus backed slowly into the alley with his lights off. Through Mrs. Herrera's kitchen window, he could see shadows moving through his living room, searching with flashlight beams. They'd find the safe, discover it was empty, realize he'd been more prepared than they'd expected. Marcus drove through the dark streets of Coral Gables, checking his mirrors obsessively. The tape felt hot in his pocket, a confession that could destroy what remained of his life or save it, depending on who heard it first. At a red light, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts until he found one he hadn't used in 15 years, Jake Morrison, Washington Post. Jake had been Marcus's protege once, before the Castro interview ended mentorship opportunities. He was executive editor now, powerful enough to make the tape matter. Marcus typed carefully, Jake, need to meet. Have story that will explain everything about 1968. Castro knew who was coming. Someone's been watching for 23 years. He hit send as the light turned green, driving toward an uncertain dawn with the past finally catching up. Marcus drove aimlessly through Miami's pre-dawn darkness, his phone silent on the passenger seat. Jake Morrison hadn't responded, probably wouldn't until morning, if at all. 15 years was a long time in journalism, long enough for protégés to become editors who remembered their mentors' failures more clearly than their successes. The Toyota's gas gauge hovered near empty. Marcus pulled into a 24-hour station off 8th Street, parking under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly. As he filled the tank, his hands shook despite the December warmth. Every car that passed made him flinch. This was insane. He was 64 years old, running through Miami like some paranoid conspiracy theorist. Maybe that's all he'd become, a broken-down journalist whose guilt had finally manifested as delusions. Maybe the photograph was fake, the voice on the phone just another exile community crank with too much time and too much anger. But Elena's bracelet was real in his pocket. The tape was real. The splintering sound of his front door had been real. His phone buzzed. A text message, but not from Jake Morrison, an unknown number. Running won't change what you did. Come to Bayfront Park at sunrise, Pier 7. Come alone or Carmen Reyes learns about her friend's true profession. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Carmen. They knew about Carmen. He tried calling her, got voicemail, tried again. Nothing. At 4:30 a.m., Carmen would be asleep, her phone charging in the kitchen like always. But what if it wasn't? What if they'd already gotten to her, used her somehow? Marcus drove toward Carmen's apartment in Westchester, his mind racing. She lived alone since her husband died, just her and the plants she talked to like children. Diego stayed there sometimes when his mother was working double shifts at the hospital. If something happened to Carmen because of Marcus's past, her building sat dark against the sky, windows reflecting streetlight like dead eyes. Marcus parked across the street and stared up at her third-floor unit. No lights, no movement. Normal for this hour, or evidence of something wrong? He sat there for 20 minutes, paralyzed by indecision. Checking on her might lead them directly to her door. Not checking might mean abandoning the one person who'd stood by him through everything. A police cruiser turned the corner, moving slowly through the sleeping neighborhood. Marcus ducked low, watching it pass. When he looked up, a light had come on in Carmen's kitchen window. She was making coffee. Safe, alive, starting another day that Marcus might have just destroyed by coming here. He drove away before she could spot his car. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten as Marcus reached Bayfront Park. Joggers would appear soon, dog walkers, the early commuters who caught ferries to the beach. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a ghost from 1968 was about to face judgment on Pier 7. Marcus parked in the nearly empty lot and walked toward the water. Biscayne Bay stretched before him, dark except for the distant lights of cruise ships anchored offshore. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, familiar scents that usually calmed him. Today they seemed ominous. Pier 7 extended into the bay like a concrete finger. At its end, a lone figure waited, an elderly man in a guayabera, his white hair catching the first rays of sunrise. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the water. Marcus approached slowly, Elena's bracelet and the tape weighing down his pockets like stones. As he got closer, he could see the man's profile, aristocratic nose, deep-set eyes, skin weathered by decades under the Florida sun. Cuban, definitely, but something else, something that spoke of education, sophistication, power. "You came," the man said without turning around. His English carried only the faintest accent, polished by years of American exile. "I wasn't certain you would. Who are you?" Marcus stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to run if necessary. The man finally turned. His face was gaunt but dignified, the kind of bone structure that photographs well. Marcus had seen it before, he realized. In newspaper files, intelligence briefings, the background research he'd done before the Castro interview. "Someone who lost everything because of what you told Fidel that night," the man said quietly. "Someone who spent 23 years wondering if justice was just another word we left behind in Havana." He gestured toward a concrete bench. "Sit. We have much to discuss before my associates arrive. And Marcus," his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Running time is over." Marcus remained standing, every instinct screaming at him to run. But the old man's certainty was absolute, and 23 years of carrying Elena's death had left Marcus too exhausted for more flight. "You know who I am," the man continued, settling onto the bench with the careful movements of someone nursing old injuries. "Colonel Alejandro Herrera, though I haven't used that rank since 1969. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Herrera, Elena's handler, the man who'd run the entire Miami to Havana intelligence pipeline that Castro had systematically dismantled in the weeks following Marcus's interview. "You're supposed to be dead," Marcus whispered. "Many people are supposed to be dead, Mr. Whitman. Elena Vasquez, Dr. Miguel Santos, Captain Roberto Fuentes, 12 others whose names you gave to Fidel that night." Herrera's voice remained conversational, but his hands were trembling slightly. "The difference is, I was lucky enough to be in Miami when Castro's people came calling." Marcus sank onto the bench, the weight of those names crushing him. 14 people, not just Elena. 14 human beings who'd trusted American intelligence, who'd believed their identities were protected. And Marcus had handed them over like trading cards. "I didn't know," he said, the words hollow even to himself. "I thought I was just—" Castro said he already knew about Elena. He made it seem like confirming details would what? Herrera's composure cracked, revealing raw fury underneath. "Would save your precious career? Would give you the exclusive you'd crossed an ocean to find?" The old man pulled a manila folder from beneath his guayabera, the same yellow color as the one in the photograph. "Do you want to know what happened to Dr. Santos, Elena's contact at the University of Havana? They found his body 3 days after your interview. Tortured first, of course. Castro needed to be certain Santos hadn't shared information with other assets. Marcus felt bile rising in his throat. Please, Captain Fuentes lasted longer, 5 days. But then, he had a family. Castro's interrogators are very creative when children are involved. Herrera opened the folder, revealing photographs that Marcus refused to look at. Your moment of honesty cost that family everything. The pier suddenly felt unsteady beneath Marcus, as if the concrete were dissolving into the bay. For 23 years he'd told himself that Elena's death was tragedy enough. One person, one beautiful, dedicated woman who'd paid for his weakness. The idea that there were 13 others, that his confession had unraveled an entire network. You're lying, Marcus said desperately. Elena never mentioned those names. I couldn't have told Castro about people I didn't know existed. Herrera smiled without warmth. But you told him about the safe house locations, the communication protocols, the identity verification procedures Elena had briefed you on in case of emergency. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Information that led Castro directly to every asset we had in place. Marcus's memory lurched backward, pulling him into room 515 at the Hotel Nacional. Castro pouring rum, asking casual questions about Marcus's preparations for the interview. Had Elena explained how intelligence assets might try to contact him? What security measures were in place to protect American journalists from Cuban surveillance? At the time, Marcus had thought Castro was simply curious about American media procedures. The questions had seemed so reasonable, so far removed from actual espionage. But every answer had been a breadcrumb leading Castro's hunters straight to their prey. The recording, Marcus said suddenly, his hand moving to the cassette tape in his pocket. I have proof of what was actually said. Castro manipulated me, made you think you were the hero of your own story? Herrera laughed bitterly. Yes, I'm sure he did. Fidel was always gifted that way, making people believe their betrayals were acts of courage. The sunrise was painting the bay in shades of gold and red, beautiful and terrible. Early joggers were beginning to appear on the park's main paths, their morning routines undisturbed by the reckoning taking place at the pier's end. What do you want? Marcus asked. Justice was never possible, Herrera replied, closing the folder of photographs. The dead can't be brought back, the families can't be reunited. But truth might still be salvageable. He gestured toward the bay, where a small boat was approaching the pier. 2 figures sat in the bow, their faces hidden by the morning glare. My associates and I represent what remains of the community you helped destroy. We've spent decades rebuilding, creating new networks, new hope. But that work is threatened now. Someone has been using your story, your supposed humiliation by Castro, to discredit our current operations. The boat was close enough now for Marcus to see the faces of its passengers, hard men with the patient eyes of professional soldiers. Not the passionate exiles who'd broken down his door, but something far more dangerous. There's a faction within our community that believes you were never a victim, Herrera continued, that your entire career destruction was theater, designed to make you a more effective double agent. They think you've been feeding information to Havana ever since. Marcus stared at him in shock. That's insane. Is it? The boat bumped against the pier, and Herrera stood slowly. 23 years ago, you had one conversation with Fidel Castro and walked away alive when trained agents died for much less. Your career ended, yes, but you survived, built a new life, found peace. The colonel's eyes were completely without mercy now. Some would call that a very Cuban kind of justice, Mr. Whitman. Punishment that looks like mercy. Protection disguised as humiliation. The men from the boat were climbing onto the pier now, their movements precise and coordinated. Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that he wasn't here to confess. He was here to be judged. Marcus watched the armed men advance, their faces grim with purpose, and felt something shift inside him. Not fear, but clarity. 23 years of guilt had prepared him for this moment, but not in the way he'd expected. You want to know the truth about that night? Marcus stood slowly, his hand closing around the cassette tape. The real truth? Herrera gestured for his men to stop. Enlighten us. I never told Castro about Elena. The words came out steady, certain. I never mentioned safe houses or protocols or verification procedures. The recording will show exactly what Castro wanted it to show. Marcus pulled out the tape, holding it up in the morning light. But there's something else on here. Something I buried so deep I convinced myself it never happened. Herrera's composure flickered. You're stalling. Elena didn't die because I betrayed her. Marcus felt the memory surfacing like a drowning man finally breaking the surface. She died because someone else already had. The pieces were falling into place now. 23 years of suppressed instinct finally breaking through the wall of guilt he'd built. Marcus looked at Herrera's aristocratic face, his perfect English, his intimate knowledge of intelligence operations that should have died in 1968. You said you were lucky to be in Miami when Castro's people came calling, Marcus said quietly. But Elena told me her handler never left Cuba, that he was too valuable to extract, too embedded in Havana society. Herrera's eyes went cold. You're confused. The trauma of that night. The man Elena described was younger, a philosophy professor at the university, someone who could move freely between academic and military circles. Marcus took a step closer. You're not Colonel Alejandro Herrera. Don't be ridiculous. You're Dr. Miguel Santos. The name felt like poison on Marcus's tongue. Elena's contact at the University of Havana, the one you claimed was tortured and killed. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. The men from the boat exchanged glances, their certainty wavering. In the distance, joggers continued their morning routines, oblivious to the revelation unfolding on Pier 7. Santos, because that's who he was, Marcus realized with absolute certainty, smiled with genuine admiration. Very good, Mr. Whitman. I wondered if you'd figure it out. You played both sides, Marcus continued, the full scope of the betrayal becoming clear. Feeding information to Castro while posing as a CIA asset. Elena trusted you completely. Elena was a romantic. She believed in causes, in the nobility of resistance. Santos's voice carried mock sadness, such beautiful idealism, such terrible judgment. The night before my interview, she received new intelligence about Castro's security arrangements. She was excited, said her contact had provided breakthrough information. Marcus felt sick. You told her exactly where to be, didn't you? Made sure Castro's people would find her. The revolution required sacrifices, Santos said simply. Elena's death served a larger purpose. And my interview? Insurance. Santos gestured toward his men, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Your public humiliation made you untouchable. Who would suspect a broken journalist of being an intelligence asset? Your destroyed reputation became the perfect cover. Marcus shook his head. But I never worked for anyone after that night. I've lived quietly, anonymously, exactly as instructed. Santos's smile widened. You've been the perfect sleeper agent, Mr. Whitman. Dormant for decades, waiting for activation. I would never... Your radio show reaches 30,000 listeners daily, many of them Cuban exiles, Venezuelan dissidents, other refugee communities. Information flows both ways in such circles. Santos pulled out a thick dossier. Every political figure you've interviewed, every exile leader you've profiled, every family reunion story you've broadcast, all of it carefully documented and reported to interested parties in Havana. Marcus stared at the file in horror. You're insane. I chose those stories randomly, based on local interest. Based on suggestions from Carmen Reyes, Santos interrupted. Your dear friend who works so hard to connect you with the community, who brings you such compelling stories about families separated by politics. The world tilted sideways. Carmen. Sweet, generous Carmen, who worried about his loneliness, who introduced him to exile families with heartbreaking stories, who always knew exactly which interviews would resonate with his audience. She doesn't know, Santos continued, watching Marcus's face crumble. Carmen believes she's helping heal her community through storytelling. She has no idea that her recommendations follow patterns established by Havana intelligence, that every family she introduces you to gets quietly investigated afterward. Marcus thought of Diego in his jail cell, of Carmen's endless kindness, of 23 years of friendship built on a foundation of lies he'd never suspected. "The beautiful thing about guilt," Santos said softly, "is how it blinds people to new betrayals. You've been so busy punishing yourself for Elena's death, you never noticed you were still serving the cause that killed her." The pier felt like it was dissolving beneath Marcus's feet. He stared at Santos, the man who had orchestrated Elena's death, who had turned 23 years of penance into an elaborate intelligence operation, and felt something ancient and furious awakening in his chest. "Carmen," Marcus whispered, the name barely audible over the lapping waves. "You've been using Carmen." "She's been invaluable," Santos replied with clinical detachment. "Her natural empathy makes her the perfect unwitting recruiter. Every tearful reunion story, every tale of separated families, Carmen brings them to you with such genuine passion. And you, Marcus, broadcast their stories with the authority of a respected journalist." Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where Elena's bracelet rested beside the cassette tape. "The families I interviewed, what happened to them? Some relocated to different cities after your broadcasts. New identities, new jobs, courtesy of Cuban intelligence. Others simply disappeared from Miami's exile community." Santos shrugged. "Information is a weapon, Mr. Whitman. You've been firing it blindly for over 2 decades. The armed men flanking Santos were shifting uncomfortably, their earlier certainty replaced by confusion. They'd come expecting to confront a traitor. Instead, they were witnessing the exposure of an operation none of them had suspected. Marcus pulled out the cassette tape, holding it like a talisman. "This recording proves you're lying. Castro manipulated me, yes, but I never agreed to work for him. I never—" "Listen to it," Santos interrupted, his voice carrying absolute confidence. "Really listen, Marcus. Not to what Castro said, but to what you said. The enthusiasm in your voice when he praised your insight, the way you leaned forward when he suggested you could do important work after returning to America." The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. Room 515, Castro's knowing smile, the seductive feeling of being chosen for something significant. Had there been a moment when Marcus had nodded, when Castro's subtle recruitment pitch had found purchase in his ambitious heart? "Even if that's true, even if I somehow agreed to something in that room, I never followed through. I never passed information. Never." "You didn't need to," Santos said gently. "That's the beauty of the operation. Your guilty conscience did all the work. Every story Carmen brought you, every interview about families torn apart by politics, you told their stories with such passion because you believed you were atoning for Elena's death." Marcus felt the crushing weight of understanding. Carmen's endless supply of compelling human interest stories, her uncanny ability to connect him with subjects who would open up completely, trust a stranger with their deepest family secrets. The way she always knew exactly which stories would resonate with his audience. 23 years, Marcus breathed. 23 years of unknowingly, of serving the revolution that killed the woman you loved, Santos finished. Fidel would have appreciated the poetry of it. The sun was fully up now, painting Biscayne Bay in brilliant gold. Morning commuters were beginning to fill the park's pathways, their conversations and laughter carrying across the water like echoes from a different world. A world where people like Carmen existed without ulterior motives, where friendship wasn't a tool of espionage. Marcus looked at Santos's weathered face and saw Elena's killer. Not Castro, not Cuban intelligence as some abstract entity, but this specific man who had held Elena's trust and used it to lead her to her death. The guilt that had defined Marcus's life for over 2 decades suddenly transformed into something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Where is she?" Marcus asked quietly. "Carmen?" "Safe in her apartment, making coffee and planning which heart-wrenching story to bring you next. She truly cares about you, Marcus. That part was never fabricated." Marcus stepped closer to Santos, close enough to see the calculation behind the old man's eyes. "I mean Elena. Where did you bury her?" Santos's composure flickered for the first time. "That's not—" "You killed her personally, didn't you? Not Castro's security forces. You." Marcus felt Elena's bracelet burning against his palm. You met her at the safe house, told her you had new intelligence about my interview. She trusted you completely. The armed men were looking increasingly uncomfortable, their weapons lowering slightly as they witnessed their commander being stripped of his careful facade. The revolution required, Santos began. The revolution required you to murder a 26-year-old woman who believed in freedom, Marcus interrupted. Everything else, the network, the other agents, my supposed confession, all of it was cover for that one killing. Santos straightened, his mask of elderly dignity slipping entirely. You understand nothing about sacrifice. I understand that you've spent 23 years building an elaborate lie to justify what you did to her. Marcus pulled Elena's bracelet from his pocket, letting it catch the morning light. But that ends now. The cassette tape in his other hand suddenly felt less like evidence and more like ammunition. Santos stared at the silver bracelet in Marcus's hand, and for the first time in 23 years, his mask of control completely shattered. Where did you get that? Elena was wearing it the night she died. Marcus's voice carried the weight of accumulated grief and fury. The night you led her to the safe house and killed her with your own hands. You don't understand the complexities. I understand that you're a coward. Marcus stepped forward, the cassette tape gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. You spent decades hiding behind ideology and elaborate conspiracies to justify murdering a woman who trusted you. The armed men were backing away now, their weapons lowered, their faces reflecting confusion and growing disgust. They'd followed Santos believing they were pursuing justice for their community, not covering up his personal crimes. Santos reached for his sidearm, but his movements were desperate, sloppy. Marcus was already moving, 23 years of suppressed rage finally finding its target. He tackled Santos sideways, both men crashing into the pier's wooden railing. She loved you like a father, Marcus shouted, his hands wrapping around Santos's throat. She called you El Profesor, with such respect, such... Santos drove his knee upward, breaking Marcus's grip. Both men rolled across the pier's weathered planks, decades of careful planning and patient manipulation dissolving into raw violence. You think you're righteous? Santos gasped, struggling to his feet. You gave Castro everything he needed to destroy our entire network. 13 people died because of your weakness. Marcus rose slowly, Elena's bracelet still clutched in his left hand. Show me the photographs. What? The supposed victims of my confession. Show me their faces. Santos hesitated, and Marcus knew. The file folder lay scattered nearby, its contents spilled across the pier. Marcus lunged for it, gathering the photographs Santos had used to torment him with guilt. The pictures were real, faces of the dead, marked by violence and torture. But the dates were wrong. All of them died before 1968, before Marcus ever set foot in Cuba. You fabricated everything, Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder and rage. The entire network story, the 13 victims, all lies to make me believe my confession mattered. It did matter, Santos snarled. Your humiliation on television, your destroyed career, it made you perfect, untouchable. No one suspects a broken man. Marcus felt the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Carmen isn't your unwitting asset. She knows exactly what she's doing. Santos's silence was confirmation enough. Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing Carmen's number with steady fingers. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with concern. Marcus, are you all right? You sound... How long have you known Miguel Santos? The pause was microscopic, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't spent decades reading voices for truth. But Marcus heard it, that tiny hesitation before Carmen's training kicked in. I don't know anyone by that name, querido. Are you feeling okay? You've been under such stress. Marcus ended the call and looked at Santos, who was watching with grudging admiration. 23 years, Marcus said quietly. Both of you, playing the long game. Carmen becoming my friend, my confidant, making me believe in human connection again after Elena's death. She saved your life, Santos replied. After your breakdown, you were talking about suicide. Carmen gave you purpose, community, reasons to keep broadcasting. So I could unknowingly expose exile families to Cuban intelligence, so you could serve a cause larger than your own guilt. Marcus raised the cassette tape, letting the morning sun illuminate it. This recording proves Elena died for nothing, that my supposed confession was meaningless, that you killed her simply to protect your own position as a double agent. Santos's face hardened. That tape proves nothing except your own complicity. Destroy it, Marcus. Walk away. Continue your quiet life with Carmen's friendship and your small radio show. Some truths are too dangerous to reveal. Marcus thought of Carmen's kindness, her genuine concern for his loneliness. Even if she was Santos's asset, even if their friendship was built on manipulation, part of it had been real. He could feel that truth in his bones. But Elena's bracelet was warm in his palm, and Elena deserved better than quiet complicity. Marcus walked to the pier's edge, where Santos's boat waited with its crew of confused gunmen. He held up the cassette tape. Elena Vasquez died because she believed in freedom, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years in broadcasting. She died because Miguel Santos, the man you know as Colonel Herrera, murdered her to protect his position as a double agent. He pressed play on his phone, activating its recording function. And this is the proof. Santos lunged forward, but the armed men, his own people, stepped between them, their weapons now trained on their former commander. The cassette tape continued playing in Marcus's hand, Castro's voice drifting across the morning air like a ghost from 1968. You understand, Mr. Whitman, that truth is a luxury neither of us can afford. Marcus let the recording play for 30 seconds before stopping it. The exile fighters stared at Santos with undisguised revulsion, 23 years of lies crumbling in the space of a single revelation. Take him, Marcus said quietly. Let the community decide what justice looks like. Santos was dragged toward the boat, his aristocratic composure finally shattered completely. You think this changes anything? He shouted over his shoulder. Carmen will disappear before you reach your car. The operation continues. Elena's death still serves the revolution. Marcus watched the boat pull away from the pier, carrying Santos toward whatever justice awaited him in Miami's exile community. He felt neither satisfaction nor closure, only an enormous emptiness where 23 years of guilt had lived. His phone buzzed. A text from Carmen. Thinking of you today. Coffee later? I have a beautiful story about a family reunion that might interest you. Marcus stared at the message, seeing all the coded manipulation behind her caring words. Another family to expose, another story to weaponize. He typed back, I know about Miguel Santos. The response came immediately, I'm sorry, querido. So very sorry. Then nothing. Marcus drove to Carmen's apartment building, but the superintendent told him she'd moved out that morning. Paid cash, left no forwarding address, just vanished, like she'd never existed at all. 3 days later, Marcus sat in his radio station booth, staring at the microphone that had been his companion for over 2 decades. The cassette tape lay on the console beside Elena's bracelet, both artifacts of a truth that felt simultaneously revelatory and meaningless. He'd spent 72 hours deciding whether to broadcast Santos's confession. The story would destroy what remained of his reputation, expose him as an unwitting intelligence asset, probably end his career permanently. But it would also clear Elena's memory and reveal the scope of Santos's decades-long deception. Marcus pressed the on-air button and leaned into the microphone. Good morning, Miami. This is Marcus Whitman, and today I'm going to tell you about the night I tried to humiliate Fidel Castro on live television. For the next hour, Marcus told the entire story. The failed interview, his supposed confession, Elena's death, the 23 years of guilt and manipulation that followed. He played portions of Castro's recording, read excerpts from Santos's fabricated files, admitted his own complicity in the intelligence operation he'd never known he was serving. The phone lines lit up immediately, exile families demanding explanations, former listeners expressing betrayal, journalists smelling blood in the water. But Marcus ignored them all, focused only on the truth he was finally speaking aloud. When he finished, the station manager was waiting outside the booth. Clean out your desk, Marcus. You're done here. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. He gathered Elena's bracelet and the cassette tape, leaving behind 23 years of careful anonymity. 6 months later, Marcus sat on a different pier in Key West, watching fishing boats return with their morning catch. The book proposal had been rejected by 17 publishers. Too unbelievable, they said, too conspiracy-minded. His savings were nearly exhausted and his phone rarely rang anymore. But for the first time since 1968, he slept through the night without dreaming of room 515. A pelican landed nearby, regarding Marcus with ancient eyes. The morning sun painted the water in shades of gold and turquoise, and somewhere in the distance a radio was playing salsa music. Marcus pulled out Elena's bracelet, letting it catch the light one final time. Then he stood and walked to the pier's edge, holding the silver chain above the water. "This is for you," he whispered, and let it fall. The bracelet disappeared beneath the surface without a splash, finally at rest after 23 years of bearing witness to lies and manipulation. Marcus watched the ripples fade, feeling Elena's memory settle into something approaching peace. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The truth has many fathers, but it only has one mother. Thank you for choosing her. A friend." Marcus stared at the message, wondering if Carmen had sent it, or Santos from whatever hole he'd crawled into, or someone else entirely from the intelligence networks that apparently surrounded him like invisible webs. Then he deleted the message and turned off his phone. The pelican cocked its head as if asking a question. Marcus smiled and walked back toward shore, leaving behind the pier where he'd finally learned the difference between truth and justice, between guilt and responsibility, between the story he'd believed about his life and the one he was finally ready to live. Behind him, the water held its secrets, and the sun continued its ancient journey across an endless sky.